Welcome back, Mike. I'm excited, as you can tell, to have you here. Thank you so much for taking time to come and do part 2 with me. I've been looking forward to this one.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for having me back. So did you have a lot of backlash from the the first show?
Yeah, like not backlash from the show. It was because the information that I've been learning. And then I kind of talked to I have a few musician friends that are really big Beatles fans. And it's really weird that when you start questioning anything about their songwriting or their musicianship in the early days, like when we were talking about in Germany and stuff like that, they get really defensive. Like, no, they were always amazing. They were always great artists. They were always this. They were always that. And I'm just like, I'm not saying that they didn't become great. I never said that. I don't think anyone has. But I'm saying they're not. They were kind of built, and then they really get upset.
Yeah, well, they were not great when they started.
I know.
You don't have to take my word for it. For those who believe that and are listening, all you need to do is go back and listen to the interviews that the Beatles themselves, especially the guy that's playing Paul McCartney, Billy Shears, in a number of interviews that he's done, he has said that in the beginning they weren't very good. But in any case, you were describing the reaction, which is something that I'm very used to, by the way. I was just...
I can imagine.
Yeah. But what Tavistock, and we'll get into Tavistock, what they're very, very good at doing is creating cults. And so when you look at the Beatles, they are a cult. They're a huge cult with a huge following. I would argue that it's a religion. It's another ism.
People react to it, Mike, as it is.
Yes.
I saw it. Like I said, I've had discussions, and the only time I've had a little bit of good discussions. I don't like to call them arguments because they never argue. Sometimes it gets a little heated, but it's a discussion.
Yeah.
And the only time I was really shocked because it's music to me, and I'm like, why are we arguing? I mean, this isn't my hill to die on. It's just what it is. And but people that are religious get that way. So you make a point.
It's a very emotional reaction. They become very triggered because you're cutting across their belief system. And you can't blame them because when you think about it, I think we spoke about this in the previous show, Rick, the Beatles story, the official narrative, has been hammered into people's heads for 60 years. Think about that. For 60 years. And so that's the story that people have come to know. That's what they're acclimated with. So when somebody like myself, or if you're asking questions and we're cutting across the grain, that gets very uncomfortable for many people, for the believers. And for those who are believers and Beatle fans, or maybe even a Beatle fanatic, let me just say again, like I said in the first show, I was a Beatle freak.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very difficult pill for me to swallow as well as I was going down this path to understand what they were really about. And the interesting thing about the Beatles story is, well, especially the story that I'm looking into, what I refer to as the Cinderella story or the unofficial Beatles story, is the information that I'm bringing forth is in the public domain. It's out there. It's hidden in plain sight.
Like most things. Yep.
That's key to this. And so what we'll do is, where we left off last time, I believe, I was explaining how I was questioning the Beatles writing from scratch to record the Rubber Soul album.
Right.
16 songs. So it would be 14 songs for the album and 2 songs for a double A-side single, which was Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. And I took the audience through how quickly those songs were being cranked out.
Yep.
It was like a conveyor belt process. And I said that that's not how songwriting works. There were a lot of issues, or there are a lot of issues with that story. Folks can go back to part 1 to take a listen. But there is another problem with the Rubber Soul sessions. So it's twofold. One is the 16 songs in 30 days. Write, learn, arrange, record, mix within a 30-day period of time. And I said that, well, that's really not reality. But here's the other piece of it. The Beatles wrapped up late in the evening, going into the early morning hours of November 12th of 1965.
Mm-hmm.
On the last day, November 11th, we're told that they finished up recording 4 songs, 2 of which did not exist before November 11th. So they had to write, learn, arrange, and record 2 of those songs. And one of them, Wait, was pulled in from the help sessions from earlier in the year, the basic rhythm tracks, but they still had to do overdubs and vocals on that. And there was another song that was, they started recording, at least the official narrative tells us this, earlier in November. So I think it was November 6th.
Okay.
So they finished that one up. So 2 brand new songs, one that they started and finished up during the Rubber Soul sessions, and another song, Wait, like I said, that they brought in from the Help sessions. So that's the story, at least. But the bottom line is, we're told that they nailed down 4 songs on the last day. Quite a feat, if you ask me.
I agree.
And if you ask me, I don't believe that it's possible. But that's me, and the audience can decide for themselves. But the other problem that we have with the Rubber Soul sessions is not just the recording, the writing and recording. It has to do with the manufacturing process of the record. So we're told that after the Beatles finished up recording, again, November 11th going into the early morning hours of November 12th, George Martin and Norman Smith sit down and they start doing the final mixes. So my premise is the final mix, what that meant was to mix the Beatles' vocals, which is what they did for 30 days. They didn't write the songs, they didn't record the songs, they didn't play on the album. All of that was done beforehand. So the songs were all pre-written, the songs were all pre-recorded. So when the Beatles showed up on October 11th at EMI Studios, their job was to lay down the vocal tracks.
Okay.
And so when George Martin finished up the mixing, what he was doing was he was taking their finalized vocals and he was mixing it down to the pre-recorded instrumental tracks. And that's how the songs came together.
Okay.
Okay? So then we're told that George Martin finished up the sequencing of the songs on November 16th. So for those who are unfamiliar, sequencing means the order in which the songs are going to play on the record. So side 1 of the album, track 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Flip the album over. Side B, track 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There were 14 songs on the album, 7 songs per side. So he finishes that up on November 16th. And then we're told the very next day, on November 17th of 1965, that the final mono lacquer was cut. What that means is now they are ready to create the stampers and start pressing the albums.
Okay.
So they either started pressing on November 17th or the very latest, November 18th, because they had to get Rubber Soul into the retail outlets by December 3rd. So when you calculate the time from November 17th to December 3rd, we're talking about 2.5 weeks. And we're talking about pressing thousands and thousands of albums. So here's the problem. How could you print the album covers with the songs on the back of the album cover if you only had the sequencing done the day before they created the final mono lacquer?
Right.
How could that get done? Well, you can't print the record sleeves, and you cannot print the center labels of the 33 RPM record until the sequencing's done.
Right.
And that's a major, major problem with the Rubber Soul narrative. So we're expected to believe that George Martin finished up the sequencing on November 16th, and then, magically, everything got printed. Thousands and thousands of album covers and thousands of center labels for the 33 RPM record within 24 hours. Here's the other problem. The center labels for a 33 RPM record are pressed at the exact same time that the vinyl is being pressed. It's an automated process. So when the machine presses the vinyl, makes the record, the center label is pressed at the same time. The label for the record is not adhered to the vinyl later. It's adhered to the vinyl at the exact same time, the very time that they're pressing the record. So which means in order to start pressing the records, all of those center labels with the names of the songs in sequenced order, side A and side B, had to be in-house, on standby, and ready for the pressing process. Part of the team, when I was doing this work, has been in the music industry for a very long time, decades. Very familiar with the vinyl process, the manufacturing process. And I asked him, how many weeks for the whole process, how many weeks would that take to do what they had to do? And he said 8 weeks. 8 weeks to get everything done.
Wow.
So I said to him, well, let's just say that EMI pulled out all of the stops because it was the Beatles and it was a Beatle record that they were trying to get into the stores by December 3rd for the Christmas season. If EMI just threw everything they had at it, full capacity, how much time? 6 weeks. But the Beatles were able to, or EMI, George Martin was able to get finished up recording on November 11th / the 12th, sequencing done on the 16th of November, and the records in stores by December 3rd in 2.5 weeks. So it's a problem. I was also told by the person that was working with me on this that the printing process alone, called four-color printing, it took a week for the ink to dry on the record sleeves, what they refer to as the slicks, before they could start handling them to create the actual album jackets, adhering them to the cardboard jackets and all that stuff. So it takes a week for the ink to dry, yet they got everything out the door starting on November 17th when the lacquer was cut, in stores on December 3rd in a little over 2 weeks. It doesn't work. It's a big problem for the story. So the 16 songs is one piece of it, and then the manufacturing process, the printing process. And by the way, you know, when you do all this stuff, when you print, everything has to be proofed.
That's true.
You know, it's not like today where we have all of this digital ability and we can make changes on the fly. Any changes that had to be made, if there was an error in the printing, maybe they could have misspelled a word in a song title or whatever, that was a longer process than what would happen today in the digital age if something like that took place, you know?
Right.
So we're dealing with printing technology that goes back 6 decades. It's not today, so you can't think in terms of today's process. Okay, so that was just to finish up part 2 of what was the problem with Rubber Soul. So what happened was, once I took a look at this, I concluded that, okay, so what happened was the Beatles did not write the songs. They were not playing on the recorded tracks. The time frame in which they were operating in did not make it possible. It was not feasible. And so I concluded that between 1962 and 1966, that was the process that the Beatles were involved in. They did not write the songs. They weren't on the recorded tracks. They came in to sing the vocals. That was their job. Their job was to be a vocal group. But they were sold to us as this group of brilliant songwriters, genius songwriters, prolific songwriters,
Yep.
great musicians, but it's just a story. And again, I'm saying this, and I know that people are listening to this, Beatle fans, and this is, you're shaking your head. You're going, no, this guy's crazy. That's not how it worked, and so on. Okay? I know. Been there, done that, okay? But I'm just saying, if you're really interested and you want to break through the programming, because that's what it is, it's brainwashing. Tavistock has conditioned the masses to believe this story. And like I said, to the point where it is a cult and it is a religion. And I was in the religion. I had a front row pew in the Church of the Fab Four.
And that's important. That's important, Mike, to let people know. Like you said that in the first interview, like the part 1, you were saying that you were a huge Beatle fan.
Yeah.
Like so this isn't like you were just picking on them from day one. This must have been, like when you were learning this, you were probably one of those people going, this is crazy.
The last thing I wanted to do was to pick on the Beatles. I love them.
Yep.
And
I get it.
It was, I don't want to call it by chance or luck. I don't know. Maybe it's just some kind of synchronistic event that took place in my life when I bought the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, and I read that book, which was a difficult book for me to read because it contradicted the official narrative around the Beatles. It was 180 degrees diametrically opposed to what we have been told. So I had to get my head wrapped around it. So I could have done one of two things. I could have read the book and said, oh, this is just a bunch of nonsense, and just set it aside and go on believing the Beatles story, the official narrative, or do what I did, to dig in and say, well, is this book, is it true? Is it a bunch of nonsense? What's going on here? And so when I took the time to sit down and break the book down and decode it and go off and do the research, as I mentioned in the first show, I deducted that the book is truthful. And it does have threads of fiction in it. I mentioned this in the last show as well because there needs to be plausible deniability.
Right.
Anybody who's interested can go to my channel. Rick gave you the name of the channel. I guess we could put the link down below too, and you can go poke around. I have 300 videos that I've done over 8 years on this topic. So, and I've covered just about every angle, to be honest with you. So
it's amazing.
So in any case, the one question that comes up is, well, why did they do this?
That's what I heard.
Why would the Beatles be a psychological operation? To understand this, we have to begin to dig into the control system and the ideology of the controlling matrix. We have to start to get our heads wrapped around that. Now, the overarching umbrella is Freemasonry. The world is run by secret societies, and the people who run things, run them, are occultists. And the word occult means hidden. So there's a hidden hand. And that hidden hand includes magic. And I'll explain this as we get into Aleister Crowley.
Perfect.
Now, this hidden hand, under the umbrella of Freemasonry, and let me just explain something about Freemasonry as well. I won't go into great detail, but there is a book that I highly recommend that if you get a chance to read it, it's excellent.
Okay.
It's Freemasonry from A to Z.
All right.
And the author is John Coleman. So John Coleman is the same person that wrote The Committee of 300, and he has an excellent book on Tavistock. So it's Freemasonry from A to Z by John Coleman. Underneath the Freemasonic umbrella, there is a federation of many other secret societies. So we have the Jesuits, we have the Templars, we have the Pilgrim Society, many others, that the Knights of Malta, the Rosicrucians.
Club of Rome would be in that group?
The Club of Rome is actually an internationalist think tank institution.
Okay.
Versus a secret society. But here's the thing. People who belong to secret societies, the elites, they run the Club of Rome. As an example, Tavistock is not a secret society. Tavistock is an actual institution within the controlling matrix, the internationalist structure. The Club of Rome is the same thing. The Bilderbergs, Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS, the International Monetary Fund. So anytime we see the word international or united, it's a pretty good bet that what we have there is an organization tucked in within the controlling matrix, the deep state.
That's a great term, too. I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to say, like, all my listeners should be really on par with what you're saying and really listening, because this is what I cover on my show. I mean, I don't know how to, if people aren't listening and resonating with what you're saying, then they're not listening, because that's basically what every show I get into in one form or another. We're speaking about what you're speaking about, these shadow governments and how we are being controlled. The social engineers are in every aspect of our lives, and nothing, I always say nothing is left to chance. They have it all covered, and it goes that deep. So I'm hoping people are realizing, like, this is what I talk about, so it makes sense to me.
When I talk about the secret societies, it's also important to understand that these people, they're not just members of one secret society.
Right.
So they could be a Freemason and a Jesuit. They could be a Jesuit and a Rosicrucian. They could be a Freemason and a Templar. They could be a Freemason and belong to the Pilgrim Society. Now, the Pilgrim Society is a very powerful secret society that very few people know about.
I haven't heard that one.
There's a great YouTube channel, American Intelligence Media. They don't do a lot of videos, but when they do, it's pretty good stuff.
Okay.
So the Pilgrim Society is made up of the Eastern liberal elites. So this would be the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Fords, the Morgans, all of the names that we're familiar with. Think in terms of the American Industrial Revolution from that time period.
Okay.
Very powerful families. And they're tied into the British elitist system. So the Pilgrim Society is comprised of American elites and British elites. And the control system goes up through Britain, back up through the inner city of London, referred to as the Crown Corporation. Most people know the Rothschilds, know the name at least, a very, very important piece of this puzzle. And then you have other secret societies like the Black Nobility, and the Black Nobility draw their lineage back to Rome, back to the Roman Church. And they are very, very powerful. There are other researchers, to take it a step further, will say that the British monarchy traces its ancestry back to the House of David, a Davidic bloodline, which takes us back to where? It takes us back to Israel.
Yep. This is stuff people need to hear and how deep it goes. I think that's the problem, is a lot of people, at least I speak with, they have a really hard time knowing how deep it runs. And it's like, this is really deep, and it's very hidden, but it's hidden in plain sight. I love when you said that, because that's what I say. Like, it's out there, and to me, they're getting to the point now where they're just blatantly not even trying to hide themselves now, because they just do whatever they want, and people just say, oh, whatever. But that's what I'm trying to tell people, what we're up against. We're up against social engineers that are master psychologists that know it, how we think better than we ever could, and they have studied us, and they are steering us.
It's not easy to march through this, because it's very complicated.
It is.
And if you ask 10 researchers to explain the hierarchy of the control system, you might very well get 10 different answers.
Very true.
They'll explain the same players, but who exactly is where on the ladder in the pecking order, that in all likelihood would differ. But what I explain to people is, it's more important at this point in time to understand that there is a control system and you're being controlled. That's the most important thing right now.
Agreed.
After you figure that out, then you can do the research to figure out, okay, well, who are these people? Who are these organizations? Who are these secret societies? When did they enter into the game? Like I said, it's complicated. So to talk about the Black Nobility as an example, I think it was John Coleman mentions that some of the Black Nobility actually sit on the Committee of 300. So we're talking about very powerful families. The British monarchy goes back to, at least Robert Sepper said that the British royal family goes back to the House of David. And there was another researcher recently that said the exact same thing. So anyway, that would explain some of, in fact, it probably would explain a lot about what's going on right now with Israel.
Oh, for sure, you're right, and I'm glad you brought up Tavistock too in the Committee of 300, because I was saying, maybe I've said a lot on my show, Mike, and I know maybe in the first show that we did that I think everybody's heard that name, Tavistock, in the Committee of 300, but I had somebody once email me that told me about it, and they're like, yeah, but you got to go deeper. Don't just look at the surface of that. You have to start digging in to what Tavistock is and how deep it goes. And when I start, that's what I've been doing. That's lately what I've been doing. And my mind's blown. I'm like, wow. Like, people have to look into what Mike is saying. Tavistock, Committee of 300. When you figure that out, you're going to see the world and you're going to go, I get it, what they're doing.
Right. So in the last show, I mentioned there's two books, Daniel Estulin's book on Tavistock and Dr. John Coleman's book on Tavistock. Now, Daniel's book was, I think he published it in 2008, and Dr. Coleman published his back, I think, in 2005. So what we have to keep in mind is they're giving us all of this information about Tavistock, and that was 20 years ago. And like Rick said, when you start digging into Tavistock and you read those two books to start, it will blow your mind. And what will blow your mind even more is when you take a step back, you pause and you think, wow, and that was 20 years ago. So what has happened 20 years since? Because we're sitting in 2024 now. This all goes back to the Egyptian mysteries and back to the Babylonian mysteries, back to the priesthood. So those are the two primary threads, back to Egypt, back to Babylon. So this will give you an idea of how long this has been around. So let me just read this here. This is, I got this off of Henry Mackow's website, some interesting information on the Black Nobility. It says the most powerful of the Black Nobility families are located in Italy, Germany. Germany's important because where were the Beatles? The Beatles were in Hamburg, Germany. Where is the Frankfurt School? In Germany. Switzerland, Britain, Holland, and Greece in that order. Their roots may be traced back to the Venetian oligarchs. This is what I was mentioning before. Back to Italy, back to Rome, who are of Khazar extraction. Now, the Khazars, the Khazarian Empire, has to do with the Jewish control system, and they married into these royal houses in the early part of the 12th century. According to researcher and author John Coleman, a committee of 300 was established early in the 18th century, although it did not take on its present form until around 1897, when the China opium trade was legalized. It goes back to what I was saying before. There's a lot of players. It's very intricate. So then it goes on to say that documented proof as to the existence of the Committee of 300 is not forthcoming, and it may be no more than a convenient phrase to describe certain key players. But then take a listen to this. Socialist politician and financial advisor to the Rothschilds, Walter Rathenau, writing in the Wiener Press on December 24th of 1921, so Christmas Eve of 1921, said, "Only 300 men, each of whom knows all others, govern the fate of Europe. They select their successors from their own entourage. These men have the means in their hands of putting an end to the form of state which they find unreasonable." Exactly 6 months after publication, Rathenau was assassinated. So the socialist politician and financial advisor to the Rothschilds spilled the beans about the secretive group of 300, and then 6 months later, he was dead. He was assassinated. So this stuff is real, and like Rick said, we have to dig in. Let's go back to why the Beatles are mixed up into this. The ideology of the controlling system, of the controllers, is communism. And if we go back to World War I, we had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Lots of blood was spilled in the Great War, World War I, and the Bolsheviks won that war. Bolshevism is communism, and I have said that the Bolsheviks, the communists, made its way into Zionism. That's what I've concluded because it's pattern recognition, Rick.
Exactly.
You're seeing the same players constantly paging in and out and involved in what's going on in the world. Decisions, major decisions that are made across the world. Now, what happened was, after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Marxists, the communists, were expecting that the world was going to unite under communism. Remember the old slogan, "World Workers Unite"?
Yes.
Well, it didn't happen. So this was a setback for them because they were expecting momentum where there was going to be a worldwide communist movement, Marxist movement. So think of Karl Marx as a theoretician. Then you had Lenin, and Lenin's ways of implementing Marxism was through violence, through force. But there was another group of Marxists that said, you're going about this the wrong way. You're not going to get where we need to go if you're going to run around blatantly creating war, killing people, and spilling blood. That's not going to work. So enter a group of Marxists known as the Frankfurt School. So the Frankfurt School is really an adjunct to the University of Frankfurt. So it's not actually a school. It's a group of intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals, that formulated a way in which to get Marxism implemented worldwide without the violence. That's known as cultural Marxism. So cultural Marxism, what it looks to do, it looks to subvert from within. So they infiltrate the institutions of a country, the government, the politics, and they start to break it down from within. When you Go and you read about the Frankfurt School, and the four primary members were Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, who John Coleman ties into the Beatles, and I believe Dr. Coleman is correct, Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm. So let me just, I'll go through the Frankfurt School in a moment here, but I just want to read a quote from Max Horkheimer from the Frankfurt School. He said, "The revolution won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move towards universal egalitarianism." So when you read about cultural Marxism and the Frankfurt School, you're going to see the word egalitarian a lot. Think of it in terms of equal outcomes versus equal opportunity.
Right.
They're thinking in terms of some utopia where there is no class structure, everything is taken care of. I'm hoping most people understand at least the basic tenets of what Marxism is about.
I would hope so. And I hope they realize that what you're speaking about right now, Mike, is key. And if you're looking at what's been going on in our world, you have to, I hope they can see that this is what's exactly going on. They're infiltrating everything, like you said, from the inside and basically rotting it from the inside out.
One of the institutions, the industries that they infiltrated, obviously, would be Hollywood, entertainment, and the music industry. Okay? But we'll just put that on pause for now. So when you read about the Frankfurt School and you read about their writings, it reads like it's altruistic, it reads like it's egalitarian, but my question is it really that, or are they gaslighting us? Are they telling people what they want to hear and then go about their business behind the scenes, completely contradicting the message that they're giving to the population worldwide? Bertrand Russell, who was connected into the Frankfurt School, and I believe Bertrand Russell was also connected into the Fabian Society. Now, the Fabian Society is another organization very similar to the Frankfurt School, but they were out of England, and they were huge into eugenics. And the symbol for the Fabian Society is a wolf in sheep's clothing. They're going to make change, but it's going to be methodical and incremental. So Bertrand Russell said that the goal was to produce an unshakable conviction that snow is black. So to brainwash people and condition them to accept irrational, illogical situations, conditions, environments, thinking. So cultural Marxism looks to subvert from within. The other thing is, when we look at the Frankfurt School and we take a look at this ideology, there are synergies between the protocols of Zion and Frankfurt's critical theory ideology. So that's what the Frankfurt School was known for. Their cultural Marxism was done through a theory called critical theory. Critical theory, what it does is it divides the masses into two categories: oppressors and victims. So think about that. What do we have today? Oppressors and victims. And we've had that for a long time. We're constantly bombarded with that ideology. The intent was to destabilize society and destroy the oppressive order. So in their minds, traditional values, the traditional ways of life as it existed prior to, let's say, World War II and right after World War II, that had to go. Institutionalized religion, especially Christianity. So what critical theory does is it dissects existing social beliefs and criticizes them in a way to redefine existing beliefs, as well as values and morals, which they say were imposed by governments, religions, etc. So these government organizations and these religions are oppressive, and therefore they are inhibiting human potential. Now, I'm assuming that if you're into the truth and you've been into alternative research and you're taking a look at what's going on in the world today, you can see how this is out there today, this type of ideology. So the Frankfurt School recommended the creation of racial divides, other types of racial conflicts that have been manufactured, continual change to create confusion. That's another one of their tactics. Teaching sex and alternative sexual lifestyles to children, undermining the authority of schools and teachers, promoting excessive drinking and drugs, emptying churches. I mentioned before about the war on Christianity. Now, in John Coleman's book, he tells us that Freemasons despise Christianity. Contrary to what they say publicly, their doctrine has no room and no patience for Christianity. Also in John Coleman's book, he explains that, I believe it's the 26th degree in the 33 degrees of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, when he's told that Lucifer is their god. Prior to that, to enter into Freemasonry, all you need is a belief in a god. It doesn't matter who that god is. But by the 26th degree, according to John Coleman, it's spelled out. Lucifer is their god. Where they're going with this is a pagan-based spiritual ideology and lifestyle. And I'll talk about the cult of Pan, because the cult of Pan is tied into Luciferianism. It's tied into this paganism. And I'm going to read something from a book, a very good book, Aleister Crowley and the Cult of Pan, where it describes the attributes of Pan. And we're going to be able to lay that up against what's going on in the world today and what has been going on in the world in the past. And hopefully we'll be able to connect some dots. One of their other ways of doing things, or one of their ways of disrupting society, is to create an unreliable legal system. Dependency on the state and controlling the media to dumb down the masses and to encourage the breakdown of the family. And we'll get into the breakdown of the family in a moment, because they are anti the husband, the strong male. And the way they couch that is the world would just be a better place, a softer place, a more gentler place if it was matriarchal versus patriarchal. A lot of people believe this, but the reason why you believe this is because you've been brainwashed and indoctrinated to believe this. Men create wars. No, the elites create wars. They create all of this havoc. They create all of this chaos. They create all of this dysfunction. And then they blame the average Joe in the street. It's like the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome is responsible for all of the wacky ecological nonsense that permeates the consciousness today. As an example, climate change, global warming, global cooling, that all comes out of the Club of Rome. And who do they blame for that? They blame you and me for that. They blame you and I for the climate supposedly changing. But they never talk about the geoengineering that they have been engaged in for the past 30 years. They'll never talk about that. They never talk about the fact that they have the ability to steer the weather, to control the weather. Don't believe me? Go to MIT's website and type in geoengineering. Stratospheric aerosol spraying is another term. So the point I'm making is they create all this stuff. They create the chaos, problem, reaction, solution, and then they push it down to the people so that the people will fight between themselves. And while people are fighting and throwing rocks at each other and screaming and yelling, left, right, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, Biden, Trump, they're off pushing the ball forward, closer and closer to the goal line. The Frankfurt School promoted pansexualism. This is the cult of Pan. And what that means, it's the search for pleasure and overthrowing traditional relationships. It's hedonism. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the Beat movement, which was the precursor to the Beatles. As I mentioned, they want to marginalize the role of the father. They want to abolish the male, quote, dominance. For example, women are oppressed because of men. They want to remove the parents as the primary educators, and they want to obfuscate the difference between genders. The whole women's movement was manufactured coming out of the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. When you go back in time, the traditional role of the woman was accepted by most women, that they were the caretakers of the home, to be the mother at home with the children, to raise them, while the male or the father, the husband, had the role of provider, protector, and security. Now, this is not something that's wacky. This was the traditional role of the man and the woman. And again, I've noticed people listening to this right now and saying, no, women's rights and all this. Women's rights and all that stuff, Gloria Steinem and all that, were all put out there to brainwash the population, shifting away from a traditional role, from traditional values, and to turn things upside down. The traditional family relationships and the roles of the mother and the father, the man and the woman, put us in a whole lot better place than where we are today. Because right now, we're seeing the results of all of this brainwashing and all of this conditioning that has been jackhammered into people's heads. Many people believe this is the way it works. Well, it only works this way because it has been subverted from within, and then it has been pushed through the pipe by politicians and governments and laws and regulations and acts and mandates that were put out there to force behavioral modification.
And we're seeing that now, Mike. Like, God, I hope people, and I'm really happy to say, Mike, that I'm watching chat as you're speaking, and the people in the chat get it. Like they're they're like he's on it, he's on target, and I'm glad to see that because you guys in the chat are awesome, and I hope people that aren't in the chat and that are listening realize, like, take a look at what they're doing. And I talk about it constantly, so people know that on my show I'm always talking about how they're destroying the family unit. And they have to weaken the family, and that's what they're doing. And what you're talking about, that's not nature, that's not natural. That's social engineering, and that is mind control. That is nothing natural about what is happening.
There's a natural order.
Exactly.
Everything they do is artificial. It's forced.
Correct.
And the only way they can get away with what they get away with is if people fall in line and play their game. So the Frankfurt School also said that music can be used to promote mental illness and destroy society. And verses set to music, in other words, lyrics, and repeatedly intoned are very effective. So here we're getting into how music is going to be used to turn things upside down, to subvert from within, so that they can move their Marxist agenda forward. Theodor Adorno was quoted as saying that they could promote a culture of pessimism and despair via radio and television.
Absolutely.
For those who are listening, think about when you turn, hopefully you're not doing this too often, but let's just say, you happen to be going through the channels and you're watching cable news. Is there anything ever good that comes out of the television set? Is there ever a good story, feel-good story, something positive? No. It's always about tragedy. It's always about war. It's always something that is going to try to inflict fear and concern and worry and stress and anxiety in your life. That's the use of the media to ruin your life, to make you focus on things that if they weren't doing what they're doing with their social engineering, many of these issues would not be in your life. You'd be in a happier place, a more productive place. Frankfurt's network extends into eugenics, like the Fabians, as I mentioned earlier, population control, sexual and family law reforms. It is linked to publishing houses, medical, educational, and research establishments, women's organizations, marriage counseling, and governments, and on and on and on. Now, the Frankfurt School, the Fabian Society, and all of these other think tanks and these organizations and secret societies, they're all working together. So the Fabian Society and the Frankfurt School, they converge into Tavistock. So they're not separate. Mm-hmm. They actually, they page, it's like a revolving door, It's like our government. Yeah. When you take a look at the private sector and then the government sector. Think in terms of when a president appoints somebody to their cabinet or to the treasury and they worked for Goldman Sachs. And then once that 4-year term is up, what happens to that person that worked for Goldman Sachs? Well, they go back to Goldman Sachs or some other financial institution. The three major financial entities that essentially control all of the financials in the world would be BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. So we have this, like I said, this revolving door thing going. Now, let me just talk about the cult of Pan, and then I'm trying to get myself organized here. I am trying to keep myself organized with
You're doing incredible.
Well, thank you.
Incredible. There's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. That's what I try to tell people. Like, it's so hard to cover it because it's such a big web. So when you try, to try to weave through it in a couple hours, it's not easy because it's so much going on. So I'm glad that you're doing a great job breaking this down.
And it's esoteric.
Absolutely. Yep.
That's the piece of it that is very difficult to get your arms around. There's this esoteric, mystical piece of it
Hmm.
that is a big part of what's going on. So let me get into that quickly, and hopefully
Okay.
this will make the point. So in the last show, I told Rick and the audience about a book. It's Aleister Crowley and the Cult of Pan. So what is the Cult of Pan? So in the book, I think it's on page 36, it's the best definition of the Cult of Pan I have ever found. So Pan is the goat foot god of, quote, panic, or pandemonium, or pandemic. Okay. It is the sudden fear that seizes one who is alone in the forest. He is the god of vegetation, vegetarianism. There's nothing wrong with being a vegetarian, but we're going to start to see how there are linkages to the programming and the messaging and the social aspects of life today, how it gets pulled back into these ancient mythologies. Pan's name has been translated as meaning all, for he stands for the manifestation of nature. Now, nature goes back to paganism. I mentioned before that where the controllers are going is a pagan-based ideology. It's a pagan-based spiritual belief system. Luciferianism, panism, the cult of Dionysus. This is all the same. He is raw, undirected energy, the dance of blood along the arteries, the rising sap. He is sexual desire running amok, the god of unfettered bodily instinct. No social force contains him. He is the lord of death, of corruption, bodily decay, and dissolution. He is also the mindless mob instinct, the beast who takes control of man, the frenzy of the orgy. Wine, women, and song quicken his pleasure. He plays his pipe, and the forest resounds with laughter and celebration. Think of the Led Zeppelin song Stairway to Heaven, talking about laughter. In the esoteric tradition of the West, he often borrows the attributes of Dionysus. I mentioned the cult of Dionysus, who is the lord of wine, who provides over intoxication and its after effects. That's the cult of Pan. And a person that was in the cult of Pan and extremely influential and who plays a big, big part in all of this is Aleister Crowley. But let me just cover Tavistock real quick, and then we'll get into Crowley. Tavistock is an internationalist organization responsible for implementing change via brainwashing, social engineering. They collaborate with other internationalist think tanks and theoreticians. As an example, I mentioned the Fabians in Frankfurt, and there are many others. It reports up through the Committee of 300, and you can get all the information on that from John Coleman's book on the Committee of 300. They have far-reaching influence throughout governments, NGOs, which are non-government organizations, the private business sector, corporations, public and private institutions, mass media, global think tanks, the military, education, and the music and entertainment industry. Tavistock's tentacles are very wide and very deep. Occultism is integrated within Tavistock's psychological approaches to manipulate and transform thinking. And I mentioned that the ideology and the objectives of the controllers is to implement Marxism via cultural Marxism, and that is subverting from within. A one-world government, centralized control, Luciferian pagan-based, and Crowleyism. And that goes back to Crowley's religion of Thelema and his Book of the Law. The tenets are to pursue one's true or pure will. There's going to be a new eon, a new age, the Eon of Horus. And I'll get into Crowley, we'll talk about the Eon of Horus, and you'll see how that maps exactly to what we're talking about with the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. So the obstacles to a one-world system obviously would be traditional values. So if it's family-centric, that's a problem.
Exactly. Yep.
Traditional institutionalized religion, like I said, Christianity. Freemasons despise Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
They won't admit it, but according to John Coleman in his book, Freemasonry, A to Z, that's where it's at. They claim that, or they believe that, a rules or a law-based society inhibits the pursuit of will and freedom, and that goes back to Crowley's Eon of Osiris. And again, don't worry about this if this is not connecting yet. I'll get into Crowley. So methods of brainwashing would be social engineering, reshaping and redefining values, morals, beliefs, and ethics, creating a new culture. What is that new culture that they've created? What is cultural Marxism? How can we think of it in terms of something that we know? Pop culture. Cultural Marxism is pop culture.
Very interesting.
They want to break down traditional structures, as I mentioned. The common thread with the Frankfurt School, with Tavistock, is a thread of psychology, behavior modification, and hedonism, the cult of Pan. And they're going about their process of changing the world to move toward their one world governance and their one world religion via an alchemical process. And that process entails dismantling the old and bringing in the new. It's the phoenix rising from the ashes. The phoenix is Lucifer. Okay, so let's take a moment and let me just mention the beat movement quickly, because and then we'll get into Crowley.
Perfect. I want to hear about, the beat. This is something I want to hear about too.
Yeah, let me just get to it real quick here.
Because this is like so many of the things, Mike, as you're looking for that I talk about on this show, like the destruction of the family and what they're doing. And then when you learn about the music in Hollywood, you really, then you really start to see it. But you see it in any rock you turn, there it is. Like they're really, I've always said they've really done their job well. As an adversary, you have to respect them because they're on the same page getting it done. And we're all over the place fighting with each other, like you said.
Yes.
That's the problem.
Yes. I mentioned in the first show, Rick, that the one thing that the controllers do, and they do really well, is to set aside their differences.
They do.
They have their eye on the big picture, the goal line. And are there disagreements within the pyramid of power? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
They don't all agree on methods and tactics and whatever. But they're able to sit down at the table and say, you know what? Okay, I understand you don't agree, or we're not completely square on this, but don't worry about it. Let's get to where we need to be. Let's get to the goal line, into the end zone, and once we're there, then we'll
deal with it.
we'll deal with our differences.
Yep.
Whereas humanity does the exact opposite. They will sit there and spin their wheels, running on a treadmill, throwing rocks at each other, and with no goal line. And even worse, they're waiting for some savior to come save the day, to pull them out of the ditch. And I'm not just talking about a religious person. I'm talking about politicians. Some politician's going to get elected and everything's going to be okay. So let's just talk about the Beat Generation for a moment. So the Beat Generation was the precursor leading into the Beatles. And when we take a look at the name of the band, the Beatles, it's representative of the Egyptian scarab beetle, which is associated with enlightenment. So remember I said that Freemasonry and these secret societies go back to the Egyptian mysteries, the Egyptian mythology, back to the Babylonian mysteries and priesthood. Well, the Egyptian scarab beetle is associated with enlightenment. And there are many images of the Beatles engaged in occult symbolism if you take a look on the internet. One-eyed symbolism, Masonic handshakes, and on and on and on. Beatles, B-E-A-T-L-E-S, has ties back to the Beat movement. So Beatles and the Beat movement, B-E-A-T. Three key players in the Beat movement were William S. Burroughs, who was on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Allen Ginsberg, and Jack Kerouac. And John Lennon was a big fan of Jack Kerouac. And Billy, who plays the role of Paul McCartney, has collaborated with Allen Ginsberg. So, what do we see with this interaction? Well, we're seeing that members of the Beatles are associated with people who are cultural Marxists, because the Beat Generation were cultural Marxists. The members of the Beat Generation developed a reputation as new bohemian hedonists who celebrated nonconformity and spontaneous creativity. This would be the cult of Pan. In other words, nothing can hold you back. And this ties into Aleister Crowley. Pursue your true or pure will. And I'll read Crowley's book 77 in a moment. It's not that long. And we'll get a very good idea of where Crowley was going with true and pure will. Elements of the expanding Beat movement from the late 40s into the 50s was incorporated into the hippie and larger counterculture movements. So the counterculture movement was directly linked into cultural Marxism. into a Marxist ideology. The Beats had a pervasive influence on rock and roll and popular music, including the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and Jim Morrison. The Beatles spelled their name as a reference or in reverence to the Beat Generation. And as I mentioned, John Lennon was a fan of Jack Kerouac. And the Beatles put beat writer William S. Burroughs on the cover of their Sgt. Pepper album cover. That's the Beat Generation. So where are we right now? So what I'm trying to do is to help the audience understand that there is a culture war. And we've heard that term before, the culture wars. But a lot of people didn't know, what does that mean? What exactly does that mean? What war? What cultures are you talking about? Most people never even ask the question. It's the culture that existed prior to these Marxists getting their hands into our business.
Right. You're correct. Yep.
The traditional values, the family values, traditional religious beliefs, the way people conducted themselves followed more of the natural order. That's not to say everything did, but a lot of it did. People were more instinctual about what had to get done. People were a lot more resilient. They were a lot more resourceful.
Yep. God, so true.
Think about all of the small businesses that used to exist, all of the entrepreneurs that used to exist, the sole proprietors. Think of that. Think of all the stores that used to be owned by small businesses going back 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. What they did as part of this cultural Marxism was to create this corporatocracy, this corporate matrix.
Mm-hmm.
Remember what I said about the Fabian Society? A wolf in sheep's clothing with the turtle being their symbol, saying a very slow, methodical march. That's how we're going to get things done, which is also the exact same thing that Max Horkheimer said that I read earlier from the Frankfurt School. So what they did was they created a corporate construct where they moved a disproportionate number of people from an employment perspective into the corporate structure. So small businesses started to diminish, sole proprietors, and so on.
You're so right with the small businesses too, Mike, because even in my town, especially with COVID, there's none left. Like that was like the final, at least where I live. I can only speak for what I can see and who I've spoken with, but a lot of people I speak with, that businesses that have been generational, like you just said, for 50, 60 years are gone. Like they're boarded up, they're done. They couldn't.
It's gone.
Yeah, it's all big stores now, and it's so sad to see. But you see that they're doing their job well.
This is the Frankfurt School. This is Tavistock. This is their social engineering through their social scientists that have created this. Now, Crowley, let's talk about Crowley real quick.
Yeah, this is crazy. Oh, my God.
It is crazy. I know it's crazy. I'm going to move quickly here because we're really low on time. The Aeon of Horus is a concept of Crowley's that is based on the Book of the Law, which he allegedly channeled while in Egypt back early in the 20th century. He published the Book of the Law in 1909,
right.
Which, by the way, the Beatles song, One After 909, is Crowley's Law of Reversal. So he published the Book of the Law in 1909, and if we reverse 1909, we get 9091. It's the one after 909. So that's a very simple tie of the Beatles back to Crowley, aside from the fact that he's on the Sgt. Pepper album cover, but there's a lot more than those two examples. He was prominent within the cultic elite. He was with British intelligence. I mentioned a book from the first show. Great book. I recommend reading it. Secret Agent 666 by Richard Spence. In memoirs, they refer to Crowley as the father of modern Satanism. His religion of Thelema is the prevailing religious doctrine of the Pyramid of Power. And the Pyramid of Power is a term that I coined to explain the corporate structure of how the elites work. It's a corporate structure. It's like a big multinational corporation. So when we take a look at Freemasonry, think in terms of like Freemasonry Incorporated. Crowley believed an initiate must experience the dark side of duality in order to become enlightened and achieve illumination. Rituals included sex magic, non-heterosexual sex magic, drugs, summoning entities, etc. Enlightenment and illumination is achieved by moving degree by degree through rituals. So Crowley had taken over the OTO, and in order to achieve the upper levels of degrees within the OTO, required sex magic. Members of the OTO at the time, there were those that did not subscribe to that and didn't want to go there, but because at a certain point he let it, he mandated that if you want to get from here to there, sex magic. Crowley's teachings and the process of becoming an adept is reserved for the upper echelon of secret societies. And again, folks, this is based upon my research. Some people want to argue. That's fine. You can argue with me if you want, but this is where I landed with this stuff. Lower level initiates are used as tools to promote the Lemic satanic ideology. That would be celebrities, entertainers, politicians, etc. The Aeon of Horus will be comprised of literalists who subscribe to the tenets of Thelema. This will require extensive depopulation to remove nonconformists, so the new age starts with a devout base. Non-adherents will be relegated to slaves. And this is in Crowley's book 77. It's only one page, so if I don't get to it, just go on the internet, type in Aleister Crowley, book 77. You can read it for yourself. The controllers are playing out Crowley's blueprint for the new age, the Age of Horus, the Aeon of Horus, by applying an alchemical process. So basically the alchemical process means that they are breaking down the old structures. They're tearing it down so that they can bring in their structure.
Correct.
Let me just explain for a second here, because this will tie back to the Frankfurt School, it'll tie back to Tavistock, it'll tie back to the cult of Pan. Crowley taught that the Aeon of Osiris, which is equivalent to the Piscean Age, was an age of oppression. It was rules-based, it shackled humanity, man and woman, did not optimize their lives because they were unable to pursue their true and pure will.
Mm-hmm.
But with the Aeon of Horus, the new Aeon, which he claimed started in the early 1900s, about the time that he released or published the Book of the Law in 1909, that was the beginnings of it. The Aeon of Horus would be completely different. The Aeon of Horus was going to be a period, an age of enlightenment, of illumination, where man and women did pursue their true and pure will. And it would lead to this utopia. This is the same premise that the cultural Marxists were presenting. There are oppressors and victims. We have to get rid of this age of oppression so that we can bring in this new age, this new control system of egalitarianism and altruism. It's the same thing. I'll read the 5 basic bullets from Crowley's.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
Man has the right to live by his own law, to live in the way that he wills to do, to work as he will, to play as he will, to rest as he will, to die when and how as he will. Man has the right to eat what he will, to drink what he will, to dwell where he will, to move as he will on the face of the earth. Man has the right to think what he will, to speak what he will, to write what he will, to draw, paint, carve, etch, mold, build as he will, to dress as he will. Man has the right to live as he will. Take your fill and will of love as ye will, going back to the cult of Pan, and to do this when, where, and with whom ye will. Man has the right to kill those who would thwart these rights. The slaves shall serve. Love is the law, love under will. Now, there are Thelemites and Crowley proponents that will say, no, he's talking about everybody. Everybody's going to benefit from this. And I'm like, no, everybody's not going to benefit from this because Crowley was part of the elite system. He was part of the elite establishment. And his religion of Thelema with all of its rituals, this is reserved for adepts and initiates who are within the elite controlling system.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was for everybody, why would he say the slaves shall serve? So in other words, if you're not rowing the boat and you're an outlier and you're not buying into this, then you're not going to be in this club.
That's the key point. You're right.
We have to understand that the controllers don't care about us, Rick. I know you know this. They don't care about us. They call us useless eaters. They're trying to clearly depopulate the world. They talk about this all the time.
Yeah, they don't even try to hide it anymore.
We have Yuval Harari telling the world that they have reached godlike status. He also said that Jesus is fake news. So for those of you who are Christian out there, listen to what Yuval Harari is saying. He's with the World Economic Forum. Remember, I talked about these organizations within the internationalist structure. Well, the WEF is one of these main players, especially today. Listen to what they're saying. They have achieved godlike status. Jesus is fake news. He even talks about what are they going to do with all of the people that don't have a lot of skills. What are we going to do with them? I think he said something like we'll give them video games and we'll drug them up. Something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing, but that was pretty much what he said. So the Beatles are part of this agenda to disrupt. It was an agenda to social engineer the world on a grand scale. It was to break down traditional values. It was to be anti-establishment. It was to bring in a counterculture. It was to introduce a drug culture, to introduce free love, which goes back to the cult of Pan, especially when we got to the Beatles' psychedelic era with Sgt. Pepper. Now, the first 7 albums, or 8 albums, because the 8th album was the Greatest Hits album, a collection of oldies. So the first 7 albums would be Please Please Me Through Revolver. We could see how it all kind of started and how it was progressing through the timeline. It started very basic with their first album, Please Please Me, just basic rock and roll numbers. The Beatles were dressing differently. They had these different haircuts. Their attitudes were a little snarky, pushing back on the establishment, press, anybody who was interviewing them. There was kind of this banter that went back and forth, and that was done intentionally to make the person who was asking the question, they were perceived as part of the establishment, to look like they were dull, like they weren't hip.
Yep.
To use terms going back to the 1960s, they were squares. These are inhibited people. These are people that are constrained. These are people that are not optimizing their life. And so we're going to push back at them.
Yep, you're making great points. I just want to add really quickly, Mike, that it's really noticeable when you go back and look at old footage before the time we're speaking about, and you see how different even the music was, and they were on stage. They were very stiff, and they were kind of standing there just doing their thing, but it was a totally different look. And then what you're speaking about, you start to see this change very quickly of like just. It just seems like the wheels come off, and you have like the Doors, and you got the Beatles, and you got the Rolling Stones, and you're like, whoa, what a change, but engineered.
It's engineered. Tavistock engineers and creates the genres of music.
It's so noticeable. It really is when you look.
The British invasion, remember I said earlier that it all goes back up through Britain, back up through the Crown, the Crown Corporation.
Yep.
The British invasion, folks. The Tavistock invasion, if you want to get even more basic.
I agree.
So let's just talk about the Beatles real quick in Germany. Why Germany? Because a lot of people believe, that's where the Beatles were, that's where they were learning to write their songs and become great musicians and all that stuff. Wrong. The Beatles weren't writing any music in Hamburg. I have a Pete Best interview where he said that, goes back years ago, where he said that they were playing 7 hours a night. They had to be at the venue by 6 o'clock. And by the time they got done playing, they went back to where they were staying. In the very early days, it was an old rundown cinema. They got up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Pete Best said this, not Mike Williams, Pete Best. So they get up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they have to be back at the venue at 6 o'clock. How much songwriting do you think they were doing between 3 and 6?
Exactly.
0. Let's talk about Germany. Why was Germany important? The powerful black nobility families, which I mentioned earlier, are located in Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Britain, Holland, and Greece. In that order. That's the order of importance, how powerful those families are. So Germany is number 2 on the list, right behind Italy. Mayer Rothschild, who was the Rothschild that got this whole thing kicked off with the banking system, the international bankers, he's from Frankfurt, Germany. Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 through 1920, was a German psychologist, philosopher, and professor, and is considered one of the fathers of modern psychology, and more specifically, experimental psychology. He was the father of what they considered modern psychology, and everything after that was built upon Wilhelm Wundt. The OTO, or the Ordo Templi Orientis, Crowley, is an occult secret society, and it was founded at the beginning of the 20th century. It originated in Germany, or Austria, between 1895 and 1906. I find it interesting that in Wikipedia they really can't nail down exactly where and a year, but Germany or Austria. Hamburg is a major media center in Germany. A lot of people don't know this, and a colleague of mine, Patrick O'Carroll, sent me an email letting me know this. Frankfurt University is a 6-hour drive to Hamburg.
Wow, okay.
When the Beatles arrived in Hamburg in August of 1960, as I just mentioned, they played 7 hours a night, and it was a very decadent environment. The red light district, lots of booze. It was very, very decadent. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, just to throw this in, Many Beatle fans will know the name Astrid Kircher. Astrid was a German photographer, and her photography was known for her association with the Beatles while they were in Hamburg. And the way the story goes is that in 1960, when the Beatles were there, when they were not writing songs and they weren't a very good band, Astrid Kircher plugs into them. And now she's taking pictures of a band that is not notable, Rick.
Mm-hmm.
They're not on anybody's radar, but she's taking all of these very artistic pictures. To the audience, test this out for yourself. Watch a lot of these rock documentaries that you'll find on Amazon. Many times what you'll see is before these artists, like Tom Petty is a good example,
Mm-hmm.
there's all of this film footage going back, way back when, of the band and so on. The other one was Gordon Lightfoot. Watch the Gordon Lightfoot documentary.
I was just going to bring that up when you were done. I was going to be like, there's some weird stuff in that documentary.
The filming, Rick, there's all of this artistic film angles taken from when he was supposedly a nobody.
Exactly.
Nobody even knew he existed, right? The only person that knew he existed was maybe his girlfriend and his guitar. What's happening there? It's the same thing that Astrid Kircher did with the Beatles. That's setting the backstory. It's creating the backstory. It's setting the table to build the narrative. But Germany is a hotbed for the social engineers, Frankfurt and Tavistock. That's why the Beatles started there. That's why they were in Germany.
Makes a lot of sense, man. And God, I wish we had more time, Mike. I'm looking at the time. I'm like, we got like 2 minutes. So.
Oh, I know. I tried to get as much in there, Rick, as I possibly could.
I'm hoping to get you back eventually. You're always welcome back. Definitely. And I would love to eventually have you back again. And because I think we're building a great you are building a great foundation from the ground up. And I love that we're not just covering the Beatles. We're building this foundation, getting to the Beatles, of how this is all starting. And now we're getting into the music of it, which is important because I'm like you. I know they've engineered the music. They're into the movies. And that's what we're getting into. And you broke it down amazing. I can't thank you enough. And I hope people will check out your channels. I'm making sure I keep putting the links in there. Please, guys, go check it out. Mike gets into everything. Like if you go to his channel, the Paul is Dead channel, he breaks all of this down and really gets into all of it. So, and you can definitely do that at your own leisure and learn way more than what we're covering here. There's so much. It's how do you fit it in?
Well, Rick, what we have to understand is don't take the Beatles personally.
Right. It's a good point.
Understand that the Beatles are one of many major psychological operations that have been put in play over time.
Yeah.
Do you want a recent one? How about COVID?
Yeah.
COVID was a major psychological operation.
Yeah, I've said that too. Well, and to make it personal, even for me, I was like you were a Beatles fan. I was a huge Doors fan. The surprise I got when I started digging into the origin of the Doors, I'm like, oh my God, so I get it.
Yeah, read Dave McGowan's book.
Yeah, it's crazy. So hopefully people are going to look into this, Mike. I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for coming back here and taking time to talk to all of us, because I think this is going to get people really questioning and thinking and at least looking into things. And I want to thank everybody for in the chat. You guys were on fire tonight. And I will leave links for all of Mike's stuff. Please go check out his work. And Mike, thank you once again so much. You're always welcome back. Please remember that, my friend.
Thank you, Rick.